Yes, sir.
John Palos, Spruce Hill Road. I'm just wondering, is it standard operating procedure or is it unusual to have bylaw amendment requests for what are in effect individual properties or parcels?
No. It's not, this is not limited to one or two parcels.
I understand that, but
it so happens that there are 2 or 3 parcels under consideration, but there could well be others in the future that could come under this designation. I mean, I can think of a couple right now.
No, yeah, I understand that. You said that before, but then I also heard you say, I think, that when the actual proposal is made, there may need to be an additional bylaw amendment to accommodate the proposal.
No, we're anticipating that there is another property in the pipeline that we know has a much greater projected occupancy and therefore much greater impacts. So we're anticipating that we'll have to deal with that once we have a program for the building and we know we have a general idea of what magnitude of occupancy there is. And so we're just trying to anticipate that something that we know is going to happen.
Thank you.
Yes.
Michael Glenn, Arrowhead Road. A quick question. This is a bylaw amendment that goes in. Maybe you could explain the procedure that does somebody have to apply? Will whatever happens at that property, will whoever owns it at that time have to apply to the planning board or somebody?
The town would have to own it.
The town has to own it.
Yeah.
All right. So then there's no application or request that a specific property be part or. Well, I guess it's the logistics I'm a little confused with.
Rather than my answering that one, I think that's really a legal question. Town council, could you just describe what the process would be?
Sure. So in order to qualify initially, the bylaw requires it to be publicly owned. As Alice mentioned, there has been a provision that it can be sold into a private. And then there are procedures that are set forth in the bylaw for application to the planning board for the special permit and site plan.
I guess it's before that is my question is who if it has to be town owned, who within the town determines, if the town management determines what properties this particular bylaw applies to?
The way I would envision
Board of Selectmen, Planning Board,
would request that the planning board hold a hearing.
The Board of Selectmen would make the request. Okay, thank you.
Is that the way you understand it?
Yeah, that's not something that's spelled out here, but that was a reasonable way that something like this would be handled in that type of circumstance.
Could some other department, such as like the water that was put off to the housing, could they apply for something like this?
I don't know how that works with the Board of Selectmen, whether that would be an independent agency that could make that request to the planning board, or whether it would have to go through the selectmen in any case. What do you think, Doug?
Well, I think town meeting, just in the case of the water department facilities, town meeting transferred or authorized transfer of ownership to the housing trust. So, in my mind, the housing trust could be an applicant.
That's true.
They have custody and control, or will have custody and control of the building.
That's true.
Or the rec building, the rec department owns
school department.
School department owns buildings. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Marissa Moore, Jones Road. Just a question, is there a distinction between occupancy, which you says total number of people commonly occupying uses, and intermittent use might go higher than the occupancy? Is that possible?
We thought that that's a very good question. Thank you. We thought that that in fact the common occupancy in the old library would be probably in the neighborhood of let's just describe a program that's not all residential. Just hypothetical program. What if the reading room wing was actually retained for town use, and the reading room was a public meeting room, and the underneath part was an archive space? What would and then there are 4 units in the south wing. Just to name a program at random. The number of occupants, permanent occupants, people commonly occupying the building would not be 50, it would be 30, but once in a while you can have a meeting with upwards of 50 people, but that wouldn't count as the occupancy of the building. Do you follow me?
What determines that?
Not exactly, because I mean.
Well, you gotta have
at the
50
Women's
people there all the
Community
time.
League, at the library, when they say you can only have so many people occupying a room, they try to keep more people out.
The fire department.
But as a practical matter, the number of people that space could possibly deal with would be about, the reading room space would be about 50 people. I mean, as a planning matter. For various reasons. First of all, because of the size of the space, second of all, because of the egress. And that's one of the reasons why the community league space now is held to 50, because there's a limitation on the egress. And so what we're saying is, yeah, you can have that kind of an event at the library, and those wouldn't be counted as occupants of the building. They would be counted as occupants for the purpose of fire egress, but not for the purpose of use.
How do you define occupant in the zoning ordinance?
There are, yes. Wait a minute, there's already a question out here, Keith, just hold on for
I
a
was just
second.
going to explain, I think it's based on the state code.
There are 2 ways to count occupancy. One way is the square footage. That's the state egress, for egress purposes. And it's a different, not necessarily an overlapping standard. For egress purposes, the building code stipulates a certain square footage per occupant. But there's also the actual occupancy calculation, which is often used. For example, one of my clients owns a mill in Northbridge. It has 700,000 square feet of space. If you calculated the occupancy, he has maybe 300 employees. If you calculated the occupancy by square footage, you'd have to plan for 10,000 employees. So at some point, it becomes a matter for interpretation as to whether it's the real occupancy or the code-mandated square footage that counts. And in this case, we're talking about the number of people that you would anticipate using the building. Anyone
So
else?
is that real occupancy in writing someplace?
Yes, the building inspector would determine, it's a determination by the building inspector.
Well, no, the building inspector would determine the occupancy based on the building codes. But we're talking about the use occupancy. Can council help us with this?
It's not necessarily the square footage calculation. If the building inspector believes that the actual occupancy, the actual occupancy is never, in my experience, greater than the code square footage occupancy. If the building inspector determines the actual occupancy will be less than the square footage requirement, then the building inspector has the ability to determine that is the occupancy that would be used for purposes of permitting the building. For example, the Women's Community League can hold many more than 50 occupants, but it's limited to 50 actual occupants because of the number of egresses out of the space. So he has the ability to make those kinds of calls.
So if there were 4 units, housing units, and you had 2.5 people in each one, then you could only have 20 people in that.
No, again, we're mixing up what we're calling occupants versus the number of people that
That's
can
why-
attend a function. The number of people that could attend a function would not be counted as occupants. We're talking about people that are there every day, all day, as opposed to 50 people that come to an exhibit, for example, or 50 people that come to a meeting. They wouldn't be counted as occupants of the building. For egress purposes, they would be.
Egress and fire rates.
Exactly. For purposes of the fire egress, they would be, but for purposes of the bylaw, they're not counted as occupants.
So in other words, when there's a meeting, you wouldn't count 30, for instance, there's more than 30
It
people
could be
in
more than
this
30.
room right now.
It's just no more than 30 people in the whole building all the time, all day.
So unless it's a very long meeting.
Yeah. Depends on law.
Some of the meetings go on.
That would be a filibuster.
Yeah, well, it'd just be a normal planning board meeting.
Believe me, I know. Yes.
Keith Rose, Silver Hill. It might be beneficial to put some sort of a little explanation
Yeah,
as
looks
part
like
of your definition of occupancy, so when the building inspector comes and looks at the zoning bylaw, he's not confused to be looking at the, the state code.
Right, yeah, no, we'll get straight with the building inspector.
Does that have to be included on every time? No, I mean, does it involve
No.
main language?
Other questions? Okay. Thank you. Yes.
I think I read you quoted as saying that if this bylaw doesn't pass, that the town will not be able to enact another bylaw for mixed uses for 2 years. Is that correct?
Correct.
So, in other words,
That's it.
This really has to pass, or nothing can be done with the two buildings for 2 years.
Is that a
If there's a favorable recommendation by the board, we made changes and viewed it as different, we're able to present it back to town meeting.
It's going to depend. I don't think we could come back with something that had the same four corners. It's a question of what is in the four corners of the intent of the bylaw. And I think to come back with another historic preservation district, development district would be, that has the same four corners as this one, would be challengeable. Yes.
Just to follow up on that, that doesn't mean that nothing can be done with that structure. It's in a zone right now that has certain rules and regulations, so
Couldn't put
something,
residential in there.
you couldn't do mixed use in there, you couldn't put residential in there,
You couldn't
correct?
put residential in there.
But-
You couldn't put mixed use in there.
Right, but within the zoning
Yeah,
bylaws,
you
that
could put businesses in
you
there.
put something in there, right?
Couldn't you get a special exception?
No,
No?
not a use exception.
Bylaw talks about business, the use exception, it talks about compatible business uses.
Right.
So you'd have to make a zoning change in order to eliminate business, but it's specific in that.
All right.
One
Yes.
question. The original version of this that I read had something that had to do with the concept plan for the larger JST type structure. Is that still the idea, or do you want to comment on that?
It depends on how the program for the tavern plays out. If the program for the tavern is as it's been presented so far, that is, if it's a restaurant for, I think, the final number, if I remember correctly, was around 80 people. If it's the two community groups, the Community League and the Historical Society, and then a bed and breakfast in the tavern, then that's going to have a considerable impact, because we're talking about an occupancy, a real occupancy, well in excess of 100, maybe 130 people. And that is a considerably different impact. And so what we've been asked the town to consider is a tighter set of controls on a project that large. The development of a concept plan, similar to the AARD that we've worked on Highland Street, where a concept plan is presented to the planning board, then to town meeting. The concept plan is approved by town meeting, and then the aspects of that concept plan are followed through on by the developer. So that's a whole different, much more stringent set of requirements for major impact projects. And again, it depends on the program that finally comes from the tavern, but it's conceivable that the final program for the tavern won't be that large. We just don't know at this point. So that's one of the reasons why we're sort of waiting on that.
So a restaurant isn't necessarily occupied all the time either.
Well, I think in terms of the restaurant, the impact is not so much the occupancy as the number of people constantly attending the restaurant, patronizing the restaurant. So in this case, we're talking about lunch and dinner, talking about parking, where does it go? We're talking about people in and out, and people also multiple uses, where we have the possibility of the restaurant going full blast, the community league having an event there, and maybe an exhibit at the society, and the bed and breakfast is chock full, all at the same time. There, it's a more complex determination than just the permanent number of people sitting in the building. So. Anyone else? Great. Thank you very much.
We want to talk about timing for the report on town meeting. We want to handle that. We're doing it quick. We want to talk about
To accept the bylaw amendment as proposed, and then the report just comes out of
it's a question whether we're doing it, we want to do a world report. So then it gets the question as far as, because this is our last meeting.
Just like this.
How we're going to do, are we going to schedule a meeting and report, I mean, favorable report.
Right, we have the hearing
I know.
You have recommendations.
When you look at
I'm leaving.
No, I'm driving myself. Still have to go to my
Enjoy the
the actual
Anyways, yeah, that's a pretty good.
Mindset before we get on to the next item. Kitty was mentioning that we don't, I don't understand that. We should recommend to town meeting as drafted. We think that we need to tweak it.
It would make sense if we did to do that vote now. There hasn't been any. I didn't see anything that holds you back.
In all IB sort of reports, we typically say we received this public comment, and therefore we made these changes. Here, I mean, the minutes reflect confidence. We're not.
Yeah, I was thinking that there's actually very clear, maybe not translated, but if you read all of the language there, the egress portion and the more actual occupants, it's very clear. I don't think that there's an issue. I don't think we
Yes, I'm pushing to be in for the HSP. That's written. Okay. Good, I think we're ready to.
Katie's going to be.
Oh, okay, thank you. Not that I can think of.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.